That morning started with a quiet but strong feeling in my chest even before I got to the courthouse doors. I knew I was walking into a moment that would change every part of my life. My name is Casey Donovan, and I had spent the nights before putting together 3 old folders that became the only protection I trusted. When I walked into the courtroom holding them tight, the first thing I saw was the look my family gave me, a look so familiar that it barely surprised me. My parents sat together with my older brother beside them, and all 3 of them had smirks on their faces that showed years of not taking me seriously. I wore the only suit I still owned, a faded one I bought before I ever knew how expensive it could be to stand up for yourself. I felt their eyes look at it with silent judgment, but my grip on the folder stayed steady because I understood something they never believed. I had come prepared. Their lawyer sat down with the confidence of a man who was sure he already knew how this would end, and seeing him lean forward like winning was easy almost made me laugh. For a quick moment, I looked toward the judge's bench and calmed my breathing, reminding myself why I was here. This was not just about the $3.3 million trust they were trying to take through a conservatorship petition. It was about proving that I was no longer the version of myself they had spent years putting down. I knew the words I was about to say would change the room in a way none of them saw coming, and that thought alone kept me standing tall. If you have ever been underestimated by the very people who were supposed to believe in you, stay with me. This story will show you exactly what happens when you finally decide to fight for yourself. Growing up in my parents' house taught me early that talks about money always had a heaviness that settled into the walls of our home. And the tension it created never truly went away, no matter how hard I tried to ignore it. My brother Marcus stood at the center of that tension because Mom and Dad believed he had a natural talent for money decisions. Even though he never once showed the steady habits needed to prove their confidence was right, I watched him make choices that helped him in the moment. While I quietly handled my own bills with care, the story inside our home painted him as capable and painted me as someone who needed help. It created a heavy imbalance that followed me into adulthood, and the pattern started long before I ever had the words to explain it. I learned to budget on my own because I had no hope that Mom or Dad would offer help without attaching strings that pulled tighter each time I tried to stand on my own. I paid for textbooks, doctor appointments, groceries, and rent while Marcus floated comfortably above responsibility. But the moment any problem about money came up, their eyes turned toward me with the same familiar worry that never matched reality. The most frustrating part came from how deeply they believed the story they had built. Not once did they stop to question why the daughter who handled every bill on her own would suddenly become unable just because they decided she should be. When Grandma passed and left a $3.3 million trust only under my name, the uneasy feeling inside our home became impossible to ignore because the decision challenged the setup my parents relied on. They never said anything directly, but their reactions showed the discomfort they did not bother hiding. Marcus acted surprised, but his silence felt planned. Mom tried to smile even though her expression faltered, and Dad asked questions that showed more about his plans than about any real curiosity. My inheritance shifted the ground beneath us, and none of them handled that shift with the honesty the situation needed. Their favoritism toward Marcus became even more obvious once Grandma's decision became final. Every discussion they had about the trust happened in tones they thought I would not notice, although the certainty in their voices showed a belief that Marcus deserved control simply because he had always been placed at the center of family decisions. I had spent years adjusting myself around their preferences, but this was the first time I understood how far they were willing to go to keep an order that helped them. The realization pushed me into a clearer sense of independence, not because I wanted distance, but because the distance felt necessary for my own stability. I slowly stopped sharing personal information about my money because I knew any detail, no matter how small, could be twisted into proof that I needed watching. I locked documents, organized my accounts privately, and learned to answer carefully whenever Mom asked questions that sounded casual but carried an edge of suspicion. Dad approached things differently. He framed his concerns as attempts to guide me, but every suggestion pointed toward a future where Marcus would somehow play a role in managing what belonged only to me. Their combined pressure began to form a pattern that made me more and more protective of anything involving money. The tension stayed quiet until it came out through comments that pretended to show care. They spoke about the importance of protecting me from money mistakes, although they never once asked what decisions I had made or why I trusted my own judgment. Those conversations repeated until the space between us thickened, creating an understanding that their concern was not about my well-being, but about keeping the version of me they preferred. Each remark carried the hint that I could not be trusted, and the weight of those assumptions shaped the beginning of the conflict that eventually brought us into the courtroom. 2 years before the hearing, everything began to shift in ways I had never expected, and the stability I was building felt both fragile and important at the same time. I had settled into my job at a small financial company in Charleston after months of searching for a workplace where I could grow without the pressure of my family's expectations. The job was modest, but it let me create a routine that made sense to me. I spent long hours reviewing reports, speaking with clients, and studying patterns that helped me feel grounded. For the first time in years, I felt that I was shaping a life that belonged entirely to me. I felt proud of the structure I created, and even small wins held meaning because they came from my effort rather than the approval I could never earn at home. Mom did not understand why I wanted that independence, and she made her concerns known in subtle comments that came up during ordinary conversations. She often suggested that my older brother, Marcus, could help guide my money decisions because she believed he handled money with more confidence. Her tone usually carried the same gentle pushing she used whenever she wanted to redirect my choices. I told her that I had everything under control, but she kept emphasizing the idea that Marcus had a natural sense of responsibility. Each remark chipped away at the space I tried to build, and I grew more aware of how deeply she trusted him, even when no proof supported that trust. Dad approached the issue with a more direct plan by asking me to share access to my accounts. He said he wanted to make sure I stayed on track, but the way he phrased his request made it clear he wanted oversight rather than reassurance. I said no without hesitation because I knew what would follow if I let that door open. He repeated his request several times over the following weeks, each time with a slightly sharper tone. I felt pressured, but I refused to give in. My financial stability was the result of years of effort, and I was unwilling to sacrifice that progress to satisfy fears that did not match reality. Marcus inserted himself into the conversation soon after, claiming he only wanted to help me handle responsibilities that he assumed were too much for me. His confidence in saying that opinion startled me because he had never shown interest in my life before. His sudden involvement showed a desire that went beyond concern. He asked questions about the trust despite having no connection to it, and he spoke as if he already deserved a role in its future. His comments shifted from vague suggestions to pointed statements that hinted at control. I recognized his ambition, and the realization unsettled me more than I expected. The situation got worse when my parents gave me a stack of documents they wanted me to sign. Their explanation was wrapped in calm words that did little to hide the intention behind them. They insisted that giving Marcus authority to help manage my assets would give everyone peace of mind. Their insistence created a tense atmosphere that made my refusal feel like an act of rebellion. I read every line carefully and saw wording that would reduce my independence, so I pushed the papers back toward them. Marcus reacted with frustration, accusing me of being unreasonable. Mom looked disappointed, and Dad stared as if he could change my mind through silence alone. That moment forced me to protect the progress I had made, so I created distance to keep my stability. I stopped going to family gatherings unless necessary, limited phone calls, and focused on strengthening the independence I fought to build. The separation came with a sense of relief that surprised me, and I realized that stepping back was the only way to keep control of the life I had worked so hard to claim. 9 months before the hearing, the tension around my family shifted into something that felt more purposeful, as if every move they made carried a quiet intention I had not recognized before. During that time, my company introduced a restructuring plan that caused several departments to rotate responsibilities. I moved into a compliance position where I spent each day reviewing contracts, studying rule updates, and examining internal procedures. The work demanded focus and discipline, but it gave me an understanding of financial oversight that reshaped the way I saw my situation at home. I learned how evaluations were formed, how risk was measured, and how paperwork could influence decisions that affected someone's future. That knowledge let me see patterns that I had previously dismissed as discomfort rather than warning signs. My parents invited me to a dinner they described as an opportunity to reconnect, and I accepted because I hoped that setting boundaries earlier had eased the strain. I chose a small restaurant near their neighborhood, expecting a quiet evening. But the atmosphere changed the moment I sat down. Mom offered a warm smile that did not reach her eyes, and Dad kept a tone that sounded prepared rather than relaxed. Their conversation felt rehearsed, as if they had practiced the rhythm of each sentence. After a few minutes, Dad placed a folder on the table with the same careful motion he used whenever he wanted to control the pace of a discussion. He explained that the documents would help the family move forward. Mom nodded with conviction while emphasizing that signing would simplify the future. I opened the folder and recognized wording that would change the structure of the trust. The realization settled heavily, and I understood that the dinner had little to do with reconnecting. Lydia joined us later that evening because she happened to be in the area, and she walked in with a sense of ease that contrasted the tension around the table. She greeted each of us before taking a seat next to me, and her presence softened the atmosphere enough for me to regain clarity. As the conversation shifted toward casual topics, she leaned closer and lowered her voice. She mentioned hearing that Marcus had been asking questions about financial evaluations, specifically ones that could show me as someone lacking stability. Her tone carried quiet concern, and she encouraged me to stay alert. Lydia's warning unsettled me because she rarely got involved in sensitive matters unless she believed the situation needed attention. Marcus seemed more and more confident during the following weeks as he discussed decisions he believed I would eventually let him make. He spoke as if every detail of my financial life needed his guidance, and he mentioned information he had no reason to know. I later discovered that he had contacted a financial evaluator named Carl Whitmore, a man known for making aggressive assessments when hired to support a particular story. When I learned that Marcus had asked Carl to prepare a report about my financial habits, the pieces began to connect. The purpose behind the evaluation was not accuracy but advantage. Carl's reputation suggested he would not hesitate to interpret any minor choice as proof of poor management, and Marcus seemed willing to rely on that approach to strengthen his position. The situation showed that my family had been coordinating their efforts for longer than I realized. Each conversation, request, and suggestion began to look like parts of a bigger plan that aimed to shape an image of me that suited their purpose. I recognized the possibility that they were building a case designed to justify their involvement in the trust. The realization did not shock me as much as the ease with which they embraced the story. Their confidence suggested that they believed I would react passively, but my reaction differed from the version of me they expected. I decided to gather information quietly rather than confront them directly. Compliance work trained me to record patterns and save proof, so I applied those skills to my situation. I reviewed statements, organized timelines, and saved records that could clarify decisions I had made. I avoided revealing anything to my parents or Marcus because I suspected any reaction from me would make them speed up their efforts. Staying silent became essential because it let me watch their plans without adding to them. The distance I created earlier gave me room to prepare without interference, and each step helped me understand the importance of staying calm while handling the path they chose to take. 6 weeks before the hearing, the pressure around the situation grew sharper, and I realized that the only way to protect myself was to prepare with complete precision. I spent each evening reviewing documents that stretched back several years because I wanted every detail to be supported by records that showed clarity and consistency. I gathered bank statements, tax filings, transaction histories, and confirmation letters that proved decisions I had made during each financial cycle. The process took long hours, but it gave me control over information that my family thought I would ignore. Their belief that I lacked discipline strengthened my determination to prepare a case built on facts rather than emotion. Each folder I created became proof that their assumptions had never matched reality. During those weeks, my best friend Jenna became the only person I let near the situation. She visited after work with takeout because she wanted me to keep my energy steady while I organized the material. I trusted her enough to explain how deep the problem was, and she listened without interrupting since she understood how difficult it had become to separate shock from clarity. Jenna encouraged me to trust my judgment because she believed my understanding of compliance work gave me an advantage. Her support grounded me when exhaustion made the situation feel heavier than I could handle. She reminded me that preparation was not only necessary but also a way to take back confidence that my family had chipped away for years. One evening, Lydia called and asked to meet in a quiet cafe near her office. She greeted me with a look that suggested urgency, and she explained that she had gotten information I needed to see right away. She opened her tablet and showed a folder containing copies of emails between Marcus and Whitmore. The messages showed their attempts to influence the language of a financial report that had not yet been completed. They discussed framing decisions I made as erratic, even when those decisions followed standard guidance. The emails confirmed that they were not seeking fairness, but rather an outcome that placed control in their hands. Lydia scrolled through several more messages and emphasized that the situation was getting worse, quickly. Her willingness to share the documents gave me proof that their story had been created on purpose rather than through misunderstanding. The more I read, the clearer it became that I could not rely on a lawyer who might overlook the weaknesses hidden in those documents. I realized that representing myself in the hearing would let me control the direction of each argument. I spent nights studying legal procedures because I wanted to understand how evidence should be presented, how objections were structured, and how credibility was evaluated. I took notes on case law that involved trust disputes because I wanted to find patterns that looked like mine. The work took focus that stretched beyond comfort, but I preferred exhaustion over being vulnerable. Once I made the decision to represent myself, I created 3 separate folders that would form the foundation of my argument. The first folder contained evidence outlining Whitmore's problems, including inconsistencies in his prior evaluations. The second folder included documentation that proved the stability of my financial decisions across several years. The third folder covered procedural errors made by Marcus during his attempts to start changes without proper authorization. I reviewed each section over and over until I knew the material well enough to explain it clearly without hesitation. Every document served a purpose, and I wanted the judge to see that my decisions were rooted in responsibility rather than instability. While I focused on preparation, my family began spreading rumors that painted me as someone unable to handle responsibility. They suggested that I lacked emotional control and claimed that I made financial choices without thinking about consequences. Hearing those statements through acquaintances felt surreal because the accusations went against every fact in my possession. Their willingness to twist the truth reinforced my commitment to address their claims directly in the hearing. I understood that silence would let their version of the story grow, so I chose to let my evidence speak for me. The closer the hearing got, the more certain I became that preparation was my strongest defense. I realized that the documents I gathered were not only protection, but also a reflection of how hard I had worked to build stability without recognition. Each night reminded me that strength often forms quietly, long before anyone expects it. The morning of the hearing arrived with a stillness that felt heavier than any fear I had carried throughout the long months before. I walked toward the courthouse with the steady rhythm of someone who understood that retreat was no longer possible. The folders I prepared felt heavier than their actual weight because they represented every hour spent gathering the truth that my family believed I would never uncover. When I entered the courtroom, I sensed a shift in the air that signaled this day would determine far more than the management of a trust. It would determine whether their version of me would continue to define my life or finally be torn down in a place where evidence mattered more than manipulation. Mom took her seat with an expression that suggested certainty, while Dad carried the same look of confidence he used whenever he believed control belonged only to him. Marcus watched me with a smirk that implied he had already decided the outcome. His posture communicated victory, as if my presence in an old suit confirmed the story he had prepared with such ease. The 3 of them sat together in perfect alignment, and I realized they expected the hearing to reinforce their assumptions rather than challenge them. Carrion adjusted his tie before opening the binder he had prepared. His voice carried the tone of someone rehearsed in presenting arguments that sounded polished, even when the foundations beneath them were weak. He summarized their position, as though the story flowed naturally from fact to conclusion, and he kept an air of calm that suggested the court should accept each statement without questioning. He mentioned Whitmore's evaluation with confidence, treating it as a reliable, professional assessment, despite the obvious gaps in method that were visible to anyone trained to examine compliance records. I waited until he finished before asking permission to address the court. Judge Roberta Ellis nodded, and I presented the first set of documents with careful clarity. I asked her to examine the evaluation signed by Whitmore, and then pointed out that he had never met me at any point during the process. I described the standard procedures, required for an assessment of that kind, and highlighted the absence of interviews, checks, or reviews that would normally come with such a report. I explained each missing piece in measured detail because I wanted the judge to see that the flaws were not minor mistakes but deliberate choices that matched Marcus's intentions. When I presented the emails, the courtroom grew noticeably quieter. The messages showed direct communication in which Marcus encouraged Whitmore to shape the conclusions in a direction that favored their argument, even when the data did not support it. I explained how the language in the messages showed collaboration rather than impartial evaluation, and I pointed to timestamps showing the sequence that confirmed intent. The judge examined the pages with a focus that gave me confidence. She understood the importance of the correspondence. I then presented documentation showing the date the summons had been mailed to me. I explained the legal deadlines for notifications required by the state and outlined how the delay limited my ability to respond in a timely manner. The violation of procedural requirements became clear when the judge compared the relevant dates. I explained that although I had still prepared thoroughly, the attempt to shorten my preparation window reflected the same pattern present throughout their actions. As the material piled up, the atmosphere in the courtroom changed. Judge Ellis began asking questions that Carrion struggled to answer with the same smoothness he showed earlier. She asked for clarification on the inconsistencies between their statements and the documents I presented. His responses shifted from confident to hesitant because he could not match the evidence with the story they had built. Each question from the judge forced him further away from the polished lines he had rehearsed. For the first time that morning, I felt the weight on my shoulders lighten. It did not disappear, but it shifted just enough to remind me that truth, when presented clearly and patiently, had its own momentum. I realized that I had not walked into the courtroom alone. I had walked in with every fact they believed I would never find the strength to gather. An hour into the hearing, a noticeable shift settled across the room, as though the weight of the evidence had finally reached its breaking point. The tension no longer hid behind polite expressions or rehearsed arguments, and the sense of what was coming grew sharper with each moment Judge Ellis reviewed the documents spread across her desk. I watched her study the pages with a calm intensity that revealed nothing but suggested everything. The courtroom stayed still long enough for me to understand that whatever happened next would close a chapter one had carried far longer than I ever intended. Judge Ellis placed the final document aside before asking that everyone rise. Her voice carried a clarity that silenced every whisper when she delivered her ruling. She stated that the petition for conservatorship was denied in its entirety due to multiple procedural violations and deliberate attempts to manipulate the legal process. She explained that the evidence showed clear intent to create an inaccurate evaluation for financial gain. Her tone stayed calm, but there was no misunderstanding the firmness behind her words. She condemned the misuse of legal systems designed to protect those who truly needed help rather than control those who simply refused to be managed. She noted that the emails between Marcus and Whitmore showed purposeful coordination that raised serious ethical concerns, and she announced that the matter would be sent to investigators for further review. The look on Marcus's face shifted from confidence to disbelief as the weight of his decision settled across the space between us. His certainty dissolved so quickly that I almost felt the shock ripple through him in real time. The courtroom atmosphere thickened as he tried to stay calm, but the consequences arrived faster than he expected. Judge Ellis then spoke to Mom and Dad about the financial transfers that appeared in the extra documents I submitted. She asked for a formal accounting of each transaction and demanded transparency about the sources and destinations of the funds routed through Marcus's accounts. Her tone made it clear that this was no longer a family dispute, but a matter with legal and financial implications that they would need to explain without relying on emotional defenses. The confidence they carried into the courtroom slowly faded into a muted tension that neither tried to hide. Carrion tried to respond on their behalf, but Judge Ellis interrupted him to address his role directly. She stated that he had submitted documents without checking their legitimacy and reminded him of his ethical responsibilities when representing clients in cases involving financial evaluations. She issued a formal reprimand and told him to review professional conduct rules before proceeding with any future filings. His calm faltered, and the confidence he showed earlier shrank under the judge's questions. When she invited me to speak, I asked for payment for every expense I had spent while preparing to defend myself. I explained the number of hours needed to put together the documents and the necessity of handling the case personally to correct the lies in the material submitted against me. Judge Ellis reviewed the receipts before granting the request, and she added that the payment would be mandatory given the misconduct evident throughout their petition. Her approval felt like a validation of every sleepless night spent piecing together the pieces of their plan. As the hearing ended, Mom approached me with an expression I had not seen in years. She asked whether we could put everything behind us and rebuild the relationship we once had. Her voice carried a softness that might have moved me in another lifetime. I told her that I wished her well, but I no longer had room for relationships rooted in control rather than respect. I explained that forgiveness did not require returning to the environment that caused the harm. She listened without arguing, though the disappointment in her eyes lingered. Walking out of the courtroom, I felt an unfamiliar sense of clarity. The judgment settled the dispute, but the consequences reshaped the boundaries I needed to protect myself. For the first time, the future no longer felt pre-written by someone else's expectations. It finally felt like mine. 3 months later, the rhythm of my days settled into a steadiness that felt earned rather than borrowed. The silence in my new neighborhood in Charleston carried a different tone from the one I had grown used to, and the space around me finally felt undisturbed by expectations that were never mine to carry. I chose a small townhouse near the marsh and spent the first few weeks learning how to let an ordinary morning feel like progress. It surprised me how quickly the absence of conflict could reshape the entire texture of a life. The news about Marcus reached me through public records long before anyone decided to mention it directly. The investigation concluded that his involvement with Whitmore broke a series of ethical standards, and the company where he worked decided to end his position without offering any chance of coming back. I read the report once before putting it away, and I understood that whatever consequences he now faced belonged entirely to him. The urge to fix things or shoulder responsibility never came up, and I realized that was proof of how far I had come. Mom and Dad ran into their own share of troubles once the financial audit began. The state required them to return several transfers they had made on Marcus's behalf, and the penalties placed extra pressure on their already fragile situation. They tried to reach out through distant relatives, but I stayed firm in my choice to keep distance. I no longer viewed their struggles with the familiar mix of guilt and obligation that once followed me everywhere. I acknowledged the pain they caused without letting it control the direction of my future. The only person I kept speaking to was Lydia. She respected the boundaries I set and never tried to persuade me back into a family dynamic that harmed me for years. Our conversation stayed gentle, focused on simple updates rather than emotional negotiations. She reminded me that sometimes the healthiest form of loyalty is choosing not to repeat the same wounds out of habit. Her presence offered a sense of grounding during moments when the quiet around me carried more weight than usual. I used a small part of the trust to stabilize my new routine, although I kept most of it untouched. I wanted the fun to represent the version of myself that I fought so hard to protect rather than serve as a reminder of the chaos that once surrounded it. I focused on decisions that brought clarity rather than conflict, and I built a schedule that balanced work, solitude, and the slow rebuilding of friendships I had neglected while handling the turmoil. As the weeks passed, I confirmed a truth I had avoided facing for years. The relationship I once hoped to save with Mom, Dad, and Marcus no longer existed in a form I recognized or trusted. It felt strange to let go of the hope that had once kept me tied to them, but the relief that followed proved it was the right decision. I did not carry anger, only an understanding that the version of me they tried to control no longer existed. I ended each evening with a quiet certainty that the life unfolding in front of me finally belonged to me. The past no longer controlled the terms of my choices, and the shadows of the courtroom had faded into something that felt like closure. I stepped into each day without fear that someone else would try to rewrite my future, and that sense of ownership became the foundation of everything that came next. The months that followed taught me that protecting your peace is not an act of selfishness, but an act of survival when the people who should value you choose control instead of care. Standing alone can feel scary at first, but it often becomes the moment you finally see your own strength without distortion. Trust is meaningful only when it is earned, and boundaries matter most when others insist on crossing them. Healing begins when you stop apologizing for choosing yourself. Thank you for staying with me through the final chapter of this story. Your presence means more than you know, especially when a journey like this invites thinking about family, trust, and the courage to walk away. I truly value the time you spent listening to every detail. I would love to hear your thoughts, your experiences, or your perspective. Share your view in the comments, and let us keep this conversation going.